Bitcoin, such a valuable asset, such a strong security source, is totally isolated from the proof-of-stake world, which is exploding. Is there a way to combine the two together so that the whole crypto system can benefit as a whole? And that's where the idea of Babylon comes from, which is to share Bitcoin security with proof-of-stake networks. And we came up with this concept of Bitcoin staking. Although Bitcoin does not support smart contract like Ethereum does, there are still a lot of smart things you can do around it to make things work without a soft fork. Oh, but the bridge over liquidity is the key to the story.
Welcome to Epicenter, the show which talks about technologies, projects, and people driving decentralization and the global blockchain revolution. So my name is Brian Crane, and I'm here with Sebastian Couture, co-host of Epicenter, and we're here today with David Say, who's a professor at Stanford, and he's also the founder of Babylon. Babylon is a very interesting project that's using Bitcoin security and Bitcoin staking to basically secure additional networks and services. And that's gotten a lot of traction over the last year. So really excited to have David on today. And just before we get in with David, a few words from our sponsors.
If you're looking to stake your crypto with confidence, look no further than Chorus One. More than 150,000 delegators, including institutions like BitGo, Pantera Capital, and Ledger, trust Chorus One with their assets. They support over 50 blockchains and are leaders in governance on networks like Cosmos, ensuring your stake is responsibly managed. Thanks to their advanced MEV research, you can also enjoy the highest staking rewards. You can stake directly from your preferred wallet, set up a white label node, restake your assets on Eigenlayer or Symbiotic, or use their SDK for multi-chain staking in your app. Learn more at chorus.one and start staking today.
This episode is proudly brought to you by Gnosis, a collective dedicated to advancing a decentralized future. Gnosis leads innovation with Circles, Gnosis Pay, and Metri, reshaping open banking and money. With Hashi and Gnosis VPN, they're building a more resilient, privacy-focused internet. If you're looking for an L1 to launch your project, Gnosis Chain offers the same development environment as Ethereum with lower transaction fees. It's supported by over 200,000 validators, making Gnosis Chain a reliable and credibly neutral foundation for your applications. Gnosis DAO drives Gnosis governance, where every voice matters. Join the Gnosis community in the Gnosis DAO forum today. Deploy on the EVM-compatible Gnosis Chain or secure the network with just one GNO and affordable hardware. Start your decentralization journey today at gnosis.io.
David, thanks so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Great to be here, Brian.
The question we love to start this show with is just what's your crypto journey? How did you get first interested in crypto?
Yeah, so my background as a researcher. So in my early days of my career, I was doing research on wireless communication, how to make cell phones work. Back in the day when I started, only 1 million people have cell phones around the world, and now everybody has cell phone. So there was a revolution going on, and my research contributed to that revolution of making cell phones more efficient. So now we're at 2018. So at that point, this mobile wireless revolution has already quite mature, and I was looking for a new research area. And I came across Nakamoto's white paper, and that was my first exposure to crypto. And I read that white paper, and I got completely blown away by the beauty and elegance and the power of the ideas. And I started a research group at Stanford, devoting exclusively to research in crypto. And at this point, I'm still the only research group at Stanford exclusively focused on crypto research. Crypto as in blockchain research. Yes.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Because, Stanford has a long history, right, with blockchain research. I know there's like Dan Bonnet, I think, who's early on. And a lot of things that came out of Stanford, no, that's kind of blockchain related.
Yes, correct. Dan Bonnet is, of course, one of the world's famous cryptographer. His group, however, is very broad, focuses on cryptography, and blockchain is one of his applications. I would like to distinguish in our group the focus is exclusively on blockchain. So all our research is driven from blockchain.
Okay. And then how did that evolve into Babylon?
Our journey, our research journey, started with Bitcoin, right? Nakamoto's white paper. However, what happened in the past few years is that the research and the development has entirely shifted the energy into proof of stake networks, which kind of left Bitcoin in the dust in terms of technology development. However, Bitcoin remains a very valuable asset to this day. Is 50% of the crypto market, more than 50% of the crypto market. And its security is unparalleled compared to any other blockchains. And so the idea we had at some point was, hey, Bitcoin, such a valuable asset, such a strong security source, is totally isolated from the proof of stake world, which is exploding. Is there a way to combine the two together so that the whole crypto system can benefit as a whole? And that's where the idea of Babylon comes from, which is to share Bitcoin security with proof of stake networks. And we came up with this concept of Bitcoin staking, which is to convert this at this point, I don't know, 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 trillion asset to a stakeable asset. And that's where Babylon arises.
So I was in 2017, right? I was COO of Tendermint, the company that started the Cosmos ecosystem. And I remember hearing about Babylon like some years ago. And I think the way I remember it back then was the idea that you could take these proof of stake blockchains and they could basically use Bitcoin as a sort of timestamping server or a timestamping place, right? Where you put the sort of a hash of the block in there. So then if someone joins new, right, some proof of stake networks, they could sort of go to the Bitcoin blockchain and make sure that, it's really the authoritative chain that they're talking with. Was that the original idea or how did this kind of evolve?
Yeah, Babylon has an interesting story from point of view of evolution technology. So the North Star of Babylon has always been sharing security from Bitcoin to proof of stake networks. That's always been our focus from day one. However, the means and the technology and the protocol by which it does have gone through an evolution. So our original idea was actually an idea of Nakamoto, which is called merge mining. So merge mining was an idea that was invented by Nakamoto in around 2010, 2011 timeframe. The idea is that Bitcoin miners can simultaneously mine on another proof of work chain. And we were using that idea to see if we can share security proof of stake networks. And then we find out some security issues with merge mining. And so we moved on to this timestamping protocol. That was our second invention. That's what you talk about. Timestamping is basically sending a hash of the signatures of the validators of the proof of stake networks onto Bitcoin so that you can have a timestamp on these blocks and it gives you Bitcoin security. However, timestamping has one drawback. And the drawback is that because Bitcoin is so slow, timestamping is a very slow process. So this scale security is very slow. And as you know, one of the strengths of proof of stake networks is that you get very fast confirmation, a few seconds, as opposed to Bitcoin, which is minutes or even hours. And so timestamping doesn't really give us that fast confirmation strengthening of proof of stake security. And so our third idea was to use the Bitcoin, not the chain itself, but the asset to provide security. And that's what Bitcoin staking came from. And because you're using the asset, now you can keep the fast confirmation of proof of stake networks, but strengthen it by increasing the amount of capital by adding the Bitcoin capital to provide the security.
Yeah, it's really impressive to see Babylon's evolution since those early days when you guys were working on timestamping. I did a podcast with Fisher at Cosmoverse in Medellin, and you had just announced this this Bitcoin timestamping mechanism that effectively, as a product, would allow delegators on proof of stake networks to withdraw their capital faster, which was like a really interesting idea in itself. But then this Bitcoin staking idea emerged from there. I wonder, coming from the research side of things, and specifically, as a product that aims to, effectively turn Bitcoin assets into a derivative that would then secure other networks and everything that implies. What was the reaction? What has been your interaction or your reaction with, the Bitcoin community, which typically is a little bit more conservative and, from my perspective, perhaps a little bit more closed off to those ideas. And how has that conversation changed over the last 2 years as we've seen more and more Bitcoin L2s and more things being built on top of Bitcoin?
Yeah, so when we started with this Bitcoin staking idea, it was about 2023, about summer of 2023. That's when we came up with the light paper for Bitcoin staking, and we started talking to various communities. And indeed, the Bitcoin OGs are supposed to be quite conservative. However, I must say, overall, we find the reception pretty good. And I think we're helped by a few external forces. So if you remember, earlier that year, Ordnotes started. And that was sort of a mindset change to Bitcoiners that, hey, you know what? Bitcoin has more use cases than just HODL and a payment system. And I think that was a very important time change for us. And as you mentioned, at the later part of that year, Bitcoin L2 start emerging and so forth. And I think we kind of helped by that broader movement of sort of a new way of looking at Bitcoin. We call it Bitcoin Renaissance. And I think we became sort of a leader of that movement because we started doing this research a few years back. And I think the timing was helpful to us.
So in this discussion, right, on Bitcoin and sort of what is enabled on the L1, and should there be some kind of upgrades that allow more expressivity, more I don't know, some kind of minimal smart contract, better bridging, has been there for a long time. I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about the technical challenges? Because Babylon, because I think so far still, right, not a lot of upgrades have happened in Bitcoin, and it's still like very limited. So how did you guys manage to enable that staking functionality in Bitcoin?
Yeah. In fact, when we were discussing about Bitcoin staking, one of the early idea we had, in fact, was through discussion with Sunny Algowal. You're talking about the Cosmos ecosystem. So in fact, Sunny came to me in one of the you remembered at the Cosmoverse in Medellin, Sunny talked about mesh security, and that was a security between Cosmos blockchains. And East Denver, which was in 2024, very early, he came to me and said, hey, wouldn't it be great to do mesh security with one of the producer security as Bitcoin? That would be great. And so the initial idea we were discussing with Sunny, still remember very, very vividly, was, hey, wouldn't it be great if we can bridge Bitcoin to one of these Cosmos chains like Babylon or Osmosis, and then share security through the mesh security network? Okay, so that was our sort of initial thought. But then we had a problem because bridges from Bitcoin to any chain is well known to be very hard to build to be secure. And to this day, there's no secure Bitcoin bridge beyond just like a multi-sig bridge. And then we went back to history and we noticed that in 2015, there was an effort called Drive Chain, which is to upgrade Bitcoin to enable such a bridge to happen. It's called Drive Chain. You can look back. I think the first proposal came out around 2015 timeframe. But then I talked to Stanley. I said, Stanley, there's a problem here because today we're at 2024. And this proposal was issued in 2015 and still not passed yet. So I don't think we should wait for this Drive Chain to happen because this is 9 years down the road here. And who knows, we may have to wait 9 more years. And so we started thinking, but after this discussion with Sunny, I came back to the team, we started discussing very actively. And what we figure out basically to achieve Bitcoin staking is really a way to sort of bypass this smart contract limitation and still enable Bitcoin staking without any soft fork. And so sort of one of the key sort of new ideas this past year from a research point of view is that although Bitcoin does not support smart contract like Ethereum does, there are still a lot of smart things you can do around it to make things work without a soft fork. And so that has been sort of our sort of drive to accomplish that. And for Bitcoin staking, we accomplished that. And you may also know like new ideas like BitVM Bridge, for example. That is another way of sort of trying to accomplish that. A different functionality, bridging in that case, without soft fork.
How important is this this OpCat upgrade? And maybe perhaps would be helpful to provide some context here as to what that upgrade enables and why so many projects building on Bitcoin are just like waiting for that to come online.
Oh, so opcat is actually a very powerful thing. Opcat is basically concatenating two strings together. Sounds like something stupid, something very basic, but yet Bitcoin scripting doesn't support that. In fact, it was in the original version of the Bitcoin scripting language by Nakamoto, but it was deleted by Nakamoto himself. And so the effort here is to restore that that opcode. Now, it can accomplish many things, but one thing it can accomplish through some trickery is this notion of covenants. That is, you can write a Bitcoin script to define how you spend the money. In other words, you can't just spend the money by signing and then send it to anyone else. You can put restriction on where and how much to spend to who. That is not possible in the current Bitcoin scripting language. And enabling that turns out to be rather powerful. And it could make many things much simpler and significantly cheaper in terms of transaction fees. In other words, instead of writing a lot of code and having a huge script, you can get by with a much more compact script. And that's what OPCat enables.
Does it also enable multiplication? Is it useful in the ability to do proofs on chain as well?
Yes. So there's a lot of effort by Starknet and a few teams to do so-called a ZK proof verification on chain using OpCat. And I'm not an expert in that area, and my research does not cover that problem. But I do believe it does help with some field multiplication. I think the version of stock is called Circle stock, and that enables some multiplication. But I'm not an expert in that area, so yeah.
Okay, got it. I mean, are you aware of any of the current attempts and presumably like the ZK proof that was done on chain by the Bitcoin OS team and some of the work being done over by the BitLayer team to do a proof on chain?
So to be clear, that these efforts are not doing proof on chain. The proof is generated off chain. And so the challenge here is to verify whether the proof is a correct proof on chain so that you can tell Bitcoin to spend the money to the appropriate person.
Yeah, my statement was inaccurate, right? You want to verify the proof on chain.
Yeah, because proof generation is typically a very expensive process. And so there's no way you can do it on chain. But the verification typically is much cheaper than proof verification. But for Bitcoin, even that proof verification is very tricky to do because of the primitiveness of the Bitcoin scripting language. And so all these efforts are trying to do that. So here there are two approaches to solve this problem. And one is, as you mentioned, assuming OPCat is passed, then you can implement more efficient, say, multiplication that you mentioned. Okay, so that's one effort. But that effort has a problem because it assumes OPCat. And I don't think we're close to seeing OPCat pass at this moment. And so the other effort is not assuming OPCat, but using an approach called optimistic verification. Optimistic verification, which means what? Which means that in an optimistic case, you don't verify anything. You just assume that the bridge operator is correct in the assertion. But only when you are challenged by an external challenger, then you do the verification. And that verification you can do cheaper because the challenger can pinpoint a specific part of the computation or the verification and say, hey, you know what? I think this part you've cheated. Please show me your verification of this part, and I can convince Bitcoin that you're actually wrong. And this is a bit like the Arbitrum type ideas. And I think that approach is, in some sense, more practical because it doesn't assume OP-CAN. And I myself is doing research in that direction.
So can you talk a little bit about how the Bitcoin staking works like right now? So if somebody says, hey, I have some Bitcoin and I want to, basically deposit this in Babylon and stake the Bitcoin, what actually happens technically on the Bitcoin chain?
Yeah, so very importantly, Bitcoin staking is a completely native Bitcoin use case. So it's direct interaction with the Bitcoin chain. So what happens here is that if you have one Bitcoin, your one Bitcoin is held in a so-called UTXO, okay? So now you create another UTXO yourself, and you send that Bitcoin to that UTXO, still under your own custodian. Now, but that UTXO has a few special spending conditions. The one is that is a time lock. It's a time lock that locks your Bitcoin, and you cannot withdraw it until a certain time or until you send another request, which is like in the Cosmos chain, it's an unbonding request. So there's a time lock mechanism. 2 is that there is a slashing mechanism, and this is the crucial part of how this Bitcoin can provide security to a, say, Cosmos chain or a rollup, is that this slashing condition is activated associated with a what we call finality provider, or in more standard proof of stake language, a validator. This validator is in charge of securing a proof of stake chain or rollup. And the contract here is that as long as this validator is honest, this slashing condition is never activated. However, if it does something bad, then this slashing condition can be activated, and your fraction of your one Bitcoin can be spent through the slashing and sent to a burn address. So this is roughly how it works. So you as a staker has to pick one particular finality provider that you stick to, and it could be yourself.
Can you tell us a little bit about, so now someone is staking the Bitcoin, and then we have these Bitcoin secured networks, right? So these are some networks that now are relying on this Bitcoin security. How do the Bitcoin secured networks work?
So just to clarify, we are right now in phase 1 of our mainnet launch. Okay, the Babylon protocol is launched in phase 1. So in phase 1, only locking of the stake occurs, and there are no Bitcoin secure network yet. Oh, in phase 2 and 3, we'll launch Bitcoin secure networks. Now, so example of such networks could be, I don't know, Osmosis or rollup, like this rollup called Corn that we work with. So how does it work? Okay, so there will be right now on our network there are around 200 finality providers. Okay, so Figment and P2P, etc., Cosmos Station, etc. These are finality providers. And now, when these BSNs, Bitcoin Secure Networks, are launched, some of these finality providers will choose to secure these networks. Okay? And to secure these networks, they will sign some special signatures to certify these blocks as Bitcoin secured. And their job is to make sure they sign only one block at every height to make sure that you have a linear blockchain going. And so their slashing capability is to make sure that they do that. In other words, they cannot double sign 2 blocks to try to fork the chain. And this is where the security comes from. So when a client in one of these networks sees many these finality provider signature, then they know, whoa, this block is really super secure. And I can trust this block and I can trust the transactions in these blocks.
And then let's say if we take the Osmosis example, I mean, Osmosis has its own staking token, Osmo, and it has, a significant number of validators already. If that now becomes a Bitcoin secured network, then like how does that interact with the existing security system that's already there?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. That's right. Osmosis already have validators signing the blocks. So why do we need these Bitcoin secured signatures? Well, so you can think of a good analogy, a US analogy would be like a House and the Senate. Okay. So legislation are voted by both the House and the Senate. Very American example, but I do live in the US. So the same similar system would be happening in the Osmosis case. So the Osmosis validators will sign on the block as the first committee. And then on top of that, there's another committee, which are these Bitcoin secure signatures, Bitcoin finality provider signatures, that signs again on top of this block. So a client will check both the Osmosis signatures and the finality provider signatures and see that, okay, both committees have signed. And so this block is now getting, you can think of additional security. So think about it. I don't know. Osmosis security could be, say, 300 million worth of Osmo stick. I don't know what exact number today, but example, 300 million. On top of that, you have another, 1 billion of Bitcoin stake security. Whoa, then you have a total of 1.3 billion worth of security on top of Osmosis. Much stronger level of security than just the Osmosis stake by itself.
What's the utility? I mean, for chains with like arguably good security, like Osmosis or the Cosmos Hub, that are secured by like large amounts of stake, what's the tangible benefit for users to have that additional layer of security? Purely on the security side, I understand that there's like implications here in terms of having the ability to bridge over liquidity, etc. How does that play out?
Oh, but the bridge over liquidity is the key to the story. So, first of all, the security should be proportional to the amount of liquidity that you maintain on the chain, right? So if you want to have a lot of liquidity, a lot of asset on the chain, then you should have corresponding amount of security to protect that asset. So therefore, the value for Osmosis of increasing the security is precisely to absorb or to attract more liquidity, into the DEX, etc. Now, actually, there's a very tangible way. So this sounds like very abstract, right? So how do you get more? You get the fact that you have more security doesn't mean you have more liquidity. It's a necessary but not sufficient. However, in the case of Bitcoin staking, there's actually a very tangible way of these chains getting liquidity. And that liquidity is precisely because of a very recent development, which is all these liquid staking tokens on top of Babylon. So Babylon provides the staking layer, but what happened in the past 6 months is that several rather prominent projects have built liquid staking protocol. That is, they stake on Babylon, but at the same time, they mint an asset. So now that mint asset could appear on the Osmosis chain. So now Osmosis is getting both security from Bitcoin staking and also liquidity from the LST. And now you get both liquidity and security, and now they proportion each other, and that would increase the economic activity of Osmosis.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's really where you have a very big unlock, right? Because I think if you can tell a chain like Osmosis, look, you're going to get additional Bitcoin security, but also Bitcoin liquidity, right? And now, in addition to whatever $1 billion worth of Bitcoin security, you get like as maybe a few hundred million or something in, Bitcoin liquidity, and you can have like really liquid Bitcoin markets on there. I think that's where it starts to become like really attractive. Is this the case then? Because the security can be used on different chains at the same time, right? But the liquidity that can only go to one place. Is that right? Or
Correct. Liquidity can only go to one place. Security can be shared, and that's really up to the users. So the user takes the one Bitcoin, right? In the example, Brian, that you had, one Bitcoin. The user can say, okay, I want this one Bitcoin to only secure Osmosis. Or it can take this one Bitcoin and do what we call multi-staking or restaking, which is to stake multiple chains. That's an option entirely from the staker's perspective. The liquidity is directed to one particular chain. Correct.
so when the user says, "Hey, I want to secure multiple chains," and basically restake the Bitcoin or multi-stake the Bitcoin, then would this also involve some changes on the Bitcoin side, like some additional transactions, or that happens purely through the activity of the finality provider that the user stakes the Bitcoin with?
Everything should be reflected on the Bitcoin chain, right? Because the Bitcoin chain is the final arbiter of what happens to the stake, because the stake always sits on the Bitcoin chain. Now, if you remember, I said that the staking has a thing called spending condition for slashing. Okay, so if you decide to stake only on Osmosis, then you will only have one slashing condition associated with the finality provider on Osmosis. But if you decide to stake on two chains, Osmosis and, I don't know, Cosmos Hub, then you will have two slashing conditions, one associated with a finality provider on Osmosis and one associated with a finality provider on Cosmos Hub. So that's how it's reflected on Bitcoin, through having more slashing conditions.
And in the scenario of a slashing actually happening, is the Bitcoin basically burnt?
Yes. Not the entire Bitcoin, but a fraction of the Bitcoin.
Yeah, this is where I'm not clear. Maybe you can elaborate here. So as a staker, so if I'm holding Bitcoin and I want to stake my Bitcoin with Babylon, the Bitcoin you said earlier that there's no requirement to send that Bitcoin to a third party address. So because it's self-custodial, how would those slashing conditions be applied then?
It's self-custodial, but the slashing condition is associated with the finality provider that you chose. Okay? So maybe think of a typical example in a Cosmos chain. There's a notion called delegation, right? You delegate your stake to a particular validator, like I don't know, Cosmos Station. So in some sense, the staker is trusting Cosmos Station to do the right thing. It would not double spend and get the staker's Bitcoin, or not Bitcoin in that case, maybe Osmo staked, slashed. So the same delegation is happening here in our design for Bitcoin staking as well. And of course, you can always run your own finality provider if you don't trust anyone else to do the right job. And indeed, there are stakers that are running their own finality provider right now because they have so much stake, they don't want to trust anyone else. They run their own finality provider.
Right. Okay. So what basically you're saying is that the staking rewards are up for slashing, but not the original like collateral or like delegated tokens.
No. That's not true. That's not true. So, okay, let me make sure. the contract, okay, the staking contract is that your stake is safe, except only the condition that the finality provider you delegate to double signs. Okay, that's the contract. If it double signs, you will lose a fraction of your stake. And that fraction is a parameter, also part of the contract. So that's the promise. That's the collateralization of your capital.
So let's talk a little bit about the Babylon chain, right? Because Babylon also is launching a Cosmos chain, the Babylon chain, which is going to have its own staking token. What's the relationship between the Bitcoin staking and the Babylon chain, and then these Bitcoin secured networks?
Okay. So the Babylon chain is playing multiple roles here. So first of all, Babylon chain will be the first Bitcoin secure network. It's like our dog food Bitcoin secure network that we built ourselves. So that will be launched in phase 2 of the project after phase 1. The current phase 1 is finished. So that's the number one row. Now the second row is when other BSNs come online, which is our phase 3. Then the Bitcoin secure, then the Babylon chain will act as a coordination layer between Bitcoin and all these other BSNs. Because if you think about it, our system is actually, the whole Babylon protocol is a interchain system because it involves multiple blockchains. The stake is sitting on Bitcoin, but the finality providers are voting on the BSNs. So to make this whole system work, it requires a coordination between Bitcoin and each of these other chains. And so the Babylon chain serves as a middle layer, a coordination layer, to make that coordination work efficiently. So to give an example, you mentioned timestamping earlier. And it turns out that for this protocol to work, we need also timestamping between Bitcoin and each of the BSNs. And the role of the Babylon chain in this case is to help with this timestamping, because Babylon itself timestamps to Bitcoin. And this timestamping is very important because you need to synchronize the timing between a BSN and Bitcoin so that, for example, when you unbond a stake, then the Bitcoin, the finality provider voting power can be removed immediately on the BSN. So a time coordination is very important in this interchain system.
Right. And then the nice thing is that because the Babylon chain is a proof of stake chain, so it can have very fast blocks. So you can have this timestamping kind of, in sync with the speed of all of these chains for Babylon chain. And then that basically sort of, aggregates and timestamps that to Bitcoin sort of on the, like running a little bit behind, but still providing high degree of security.
Exactly. The aggregation that you mentioned is one of the most important things. Because imagine a world where there are hundreds of these BSNs. If each of these chains have to directly build their own infrastructure to timestamp to Bitcoin, it's just not a scalable solution to have so many timestamps on the Bitcoin chain. And so Babylon chain serves as this aggregation role so that you only need one timestamp, even though you have hundreds of BSNs.
These liquid staking tokens, do you imagine that in the future they will mostly also be issued on the Babylon chain, or could they be issued in many different places?
Yeah, so yes, we are hoping to encourage folks to issue their LSTs on the Babylon chain first, and then move that liquidity to other chains as needed. So that would be good. So we would like to sort of build our next generation of technology will be some infrastructure to support to do that in a trust minimizing way.
So, like, taking a step back here, there's been, I find this like quite surprising actually, but when I was at Proof of Stakes Staking Summit just recently, and there were people there talking about Bitcoin moving to proof of stake, and like for someone who's been in the space for so long, I think like maybe to a lot of people that just seems like a very unlikely sort of scenario. But at this point, how do you think about that idea, and like what is the likelihood that in some time, what would that look like? Bitcoin moving to proof of stake.
Yeah. So just to clarify, right? Our our project Babylon is not advocating to turn Bitcoin into a proof of stake chain. Our goal right now is to take this Bitcoin asset to make it as useful as we can. And the use case we're focusing on is used as a staking asset to bootstrap or to improve the liquidity and security of other blockchains. So that's the focus of the project. Now, in the distant future, if it happens that this idea is so successful, so much other blockchain, so much of the entire crypto ecosystem is built on this Bitcoin staking, then at some point, Bitcoiners may say, hey, maybe we can also use this security to secure ourselves, to improve the Bitcoin security. If that day happens, then it happens. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. So one thing interesting about the evolution of crypto is that Bitcoiners often said that all other blockchains are test nets for Bitcoin. Okay? So what does that mean? That means that, hey, if you have a new concept, you want to test it on other blockchains before you bring it back to Bitcoin. And in some sense, Bitcoin staking is kind of an example of that thinking, right? Because, hey, staking has been proved to be rather successful in these proof of stake blockchains. Now we're bringing part of that idea back to Bitcoin and say, hey, why don't we use Bitcoin also as a staking asset for these other blockchains? So in some sense, we go in that direction. And maybe at one point, people will think, whoa, this proof of stake idea of using Bitcoin is so powerful that maybe we can use Bitcoin, the asset, to increase the security of Bitcoin chain itself. That's a long way off, though, I think.
Yeah, I feel like it's a long way off as well if it were to happen. But yeah, I find it like sort of interesting that people are actually bringing this up as a possibility where, if you had said this maybe 3-4 years ago, it would have been no one was ever considering Bitcoin to move to proof of stake, and now it's actually being talked about. I think like one of the things that's interesting here about Babylon and like generally Bitcoin L2s is that it allows Bitcoin liquidity to move into DeFi and be better utilized in DeFi. Well, there's a whole array of chains that also would fall in this category. Many of the top 20 chains like Litecoin, XRP, Cardano, Dogecoin, these so-called dinosaur chains, right, where a lot of the liquidity is being held in wallets or on sexes and not really being utilized in DeFi very much. Now, over the last couple of months, there's been more and more conversation about allowing that liquidity to more easily flow into DeFi protocols. What is your take on expanding, Bitcoin restaking to other chains, perhaps other proof of work chains, some script chains, or other chains like the ones I mentioned, so that we can grow liquidity in DeFi using the liquidity that's already on chain?
Yeah, I mean, I could see the concept that the protocol that we came up with can be adapted to apply on other particular proof of work chains which use similar scripting language as Bitcoin. Yes, I'm quite sure there are projects probably working on that right now. Our focus is entirely on Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is a huge enough asset that if we get 1% of Bitcoin, is already quite significant accomplishment. So we just laser focus on Bitcoin.
So we talked earlier a little bit about, some of the efforts to have, some upgrades for covenants, more OPCAT, more expressivity. Now, the way you guys are building, right, you're not relying on that, but you're building basically on Bitcoin as it is. But if some of those things were to happen, would this change Babylon, or would this kind of bring, I don't know, some new features? Or is it something where you kind of feel like, no, we can make do with the way it is right now and it doesn't really matter?
Yeah, so our technology is entirely independent of soft fork, right? So that was our philosophy I mentioned. So we do not assume soft fork, and our technology does not assume that. Now, if there is a soft fork, like passing some kind of covenants, OPCAT, or something similar, then yes, that would make us to be able to do more things and in a cheaper way. So right now, a lot of the ideas around BitVM is basically to get around this covenants issue. The consequence, though, is that there are some costs associated with it. So the transaction fees tends to be a little bit high, and so that could be reduced. So I think, to me, it's mainly a question of efficiency, that you can do it at a lower cost. You can do more things at a lower cost. But for us, right now, the Bitcoin staking core primitive is already very low cost and without this soft fork.
So the Babylon ecosystem has really, grown tremendously, I think, over the past year or so. There's a lot of projects, you mentioned liquid staking assets are being built on top of Babylon, a lot of things happening. What are the most interesting and exciting things being built?
Yeah, so a lot of the innovations right now is really try to figure out how to sort of couple or add liquidity to the base layer of staking. And I think that's sort of where we try to provide a lot of support as the base staking protocol.
So what are the timelines here? You mentioned, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Yeah, how do you see, on what time frame do you see those rolling out?
Yeah, we're shooting for, right now we're in phase 1. We have opened the cap 3 times, cap 1, cap 2, cap 3. And right now it's closed. We have about 57,000 Bitcoin, 57,000 Bitcoin staked on the Babylon protocol. And phase 2, we are shooting for roughly end of Q1, beginning of Q2 timeframe to launch the Babylon chain. That's our phase 2. And in phase 3, which hopefully will happen maybe a quarter after that, is we will have a bunch of initial cohort of BSNs, Bitcoin Secure Networks, to complete the entire picture. So that's the phased launch.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on, David. It's really great to, to hear your overview. And it's super exciting. I think as as a long-term Bitcoin holder who's held Bitcoin for a long time and always been like, oh, it would be great to do something with it. I think it's super exciting. And of course, as someone, Sebastian as well as me, they deep in the Cosmos ecosystem. It's amazing that, those two things come together, and we've now seen such a vibrant ecosystem emerging around Babylon. So super excited to see how these phases roll out and how it's going to play out in the next years. So thank you so much for your work, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Great being here. Great conversation, Brian and Sebastian. Thank you very much.
Thank you.